Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Repeating, a history talk show where we discussed historical anecdotes you need to know, lest we dare let history repeat itself. I'm your host, Meghan
West.
Hughes.
And I'm Tim.
Joining me is my co host, Tim Rapone. Today, we're celebrating Black History Month by talking about both local and national Black history.
It's true.
So, your topic consists of.
I was gonna do kind of a more broad one about the after effects of the Civil War because I I'm like very dad coded in the fact that I find the Civil War really really interesting. I'm like Greg Heffley's father. He had that really big Civil War that diorama in his basement that got destroyed by I believe Greg's older brother Roderick Heffley.
I like that you're going into this.
That's why I think the Civil War is utterly fascinating, even if it's like a weird, antiquated thing. And there's a lot of different ways we can talk about it, but I have a few lined up for us. My favorite topic with the Civil War usually is, with most wars, it usually isn't like what actually happened during the war. All the real drama to me happens before and after the war goes on, when things are building up and the dust is settling down. One weird anecdote: whenever I mention Civil War, everyone's like, "Why do they call it a civil war? It's not very civil, is it?" It means civilian. At least not. Someone fact checked me on that, but everyone always
Actually,
says
I
that.
didn't know that. That makes sense.
It's a war between civilians because you have a war between northern states and war between the southern states. That's why it was called that. Anyways, uh, I'm not gonna beat around the bush too much because we only got about 20 minutes for my segment in an hour-long show. What the Civil War was about could be talked about all day long or in one sentence because it is both one of the most contended topics in American history and one of the simplest topics in American history. It was slavery. That show's over. So, slavery caused the Civil War. That's it. Leading up to the Civil War, it was. I mean, we're talking like 60 years of debates over the slavery issue, compromises between admitting slave states versus free states into the Union, and the power in Congress then, because if there are more slave states and free states, and one side would have more legislative power than the other. Usually, it was the South who had a bit more of an edge over the North in these topics. Usually, because everyone, you think it'd be more balanced, but maybe I'm being a little unprofessional in saying this, but I don't think anyone really cares because they're a bunch of slaveholders. They were a bunch of big whiny babies, and the second that the things were turning against them in Congress, they would take up their arms and they would start screaming their eyes out. The filibuster, if I remember correctly, started in a slave debate because they just would keep talking forever and ever and ever. South Carolinians had a reputation as fire eaters because they were the ones who were the first to threaten secession going back to the 1820s. Whenever things weren't going well with slavery, which was to the elite, that was how they made their money and their living, and they made a whole culture around it, they would threaten secession. And one day, they actually did it. They actually went through with it after years of threatening it.
Who was the first to secede?
South Carolina.
Makes sense.
They really were the first
really
one
makes
to do
sense.
it.
No hate to South Carolina.
A little bit of hate back then.
Yeah.
They've gotten better. Back then,
it does make sense culturally.
Back then, they were the heart of the Confederate States. The reason why the South seceded was because Abraham Lincoln, he was running on a platform of containment of slavery, but he wanted, his policy was, if I can't get rid of slavery, then let's keep slavery in the southern states it's already been legalized in, and there'll be no more admission of any more slave states, hoping, of course, that over time, if slavery can't expand, it'll be forced to die out. That wasn't enough for them. The southern states were so upset over this that they were like, no, that's it, we're done, we're leaving. In fact, they even took Abraham Lincoln's name off the ballots in many of their states just to really make sure he wouldn't be president.
Wow.
And even after they refused to see him as admitted as president, Lincoln was still the whole while trying to appease them and calm down these whiny babies, saying, okay, we won't take your slaves away, just calm down, let's talk this out. And they said no. They fired the first shot on Fort Sumter. They also fired many other first shots on Union or federal reserves, like armories, ammunition depots across the South, and war started. And then they turned around and then they said, "Lincoln, why did you fire back at us? We were just kidding around at Fort Sumter. We didn't want a war." But they fired the first shot. They seceded from the Union.
So did that mark the start of the Confederacy?
Confederacy started technically a little bit before Fort Sumter, but it wasn't sure if they were actually going to last, which is actually a good segue because if you don't believe me that slavery was the cause of civil war, you can take it from this is the most quoted person ever when it comes to talking about what the Civil War was over. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederate States and a certified ghoul, because if you look up his photo, he's absolutely haunting to look at. And again, this guy was not a nice person at all. And you're not going to feel bad for me making fun of him because he said in a speech, I believe in December of 1864, this comes from Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson, by the way. It is a direct quote from his cornerstone speech given in Atlanta to a bunch of white Southerners because the South had just seceded and they were talking about making their own country, and a lot of people were uneasy about that. Even the most ardent slavery supporters in the South, they weren't too sure if they really wanted to go through with this, if a war was worth it. And so this speech was to give them purpose. It was to solidify and harden their hearts that this was a necessary thing for them to do, and they needed something to rally behind. And Alexander Stephens made it very simple what they were supposed to rally behind. This is a direct quote from him. "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the African American," although he used a much more inappropriate word that I cannot repeat, or nor do I want to repeat, "the African American is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition," end quote. Not my words at all. That's from Alexander Stephens in 1864. No, what am I saying? 1860. God, the war ended in 65. 1860 from Alexander Stephens. He made it pretty simple. We are fighting for slavery, and that was the cause of the war. Fast forward now to 1865, the war has ended, and Southerners are changing their tune. Suddenly, they lost the war. Slavery's been abolished, and it's hard to really emphasize just how taxing losing a war is on a nation, especially a region like the South, because almost all of the fighting, except for Gettysburg, was localized in the South. Sherman's march to the sea across the deep South into Atlanta, Georgia, was nothing but burning and destroying cities and farms in its waste. And they saw their entire way of life completely destroyed, that way of life being slavery, but it was completely destroyed and turned on its head. And millions of Americans were dead. Everyone in the South knew someone who lost a life. It is extremely tolling, and they had to now contend with the fact that they lost and that slavery was done. It was over. It was not coming back. And so over time, it wasn't an overnight thing, but they changed how the war was viewed in the South into something now it's called the lost cause. They kind of romanticized their loss, and I'm sure Meg is tired of me hearing about this because I did a whole project on it last semester for a film class about the lost cause. It's one of my something that both fascinates me and endlessly frustrates me.
Is it the beautiful film that I think you're talking about?
That'll be an anecdote, but it's a piece in this machine I'm trying to get at here. After the war, there was a period of Reconstruction where the North had soldiers posted in the South to ensure that the end of slavery would be followed and that African Americans would be integrated into society fairly, or as fairly as the federal government of the 19th century viewed it being, which was problematic, as everyone can imagine. So the point was that there was an active effort from the federal government to make sure that slavery was over and that all Americans would be integrated in equality. Over time, Reconstruction kind of floundered. It wasn't as successful. Paramilitary groups, the most famous being the Ku Klux Klan, formed just to combat the efforts by the federal government to integrate African Americans into their life.
So the Ku Klux Klan was a direct result.
It was founded mostly by former Confederate soldiers. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a general in the wars. He actually stood trial in the 1870s for crimes he committed as the leader of the Klan, which he denied, but it was pretty obvious it was him. Again, this is mostly coming from James McPherson's book, Battle Cry of Freedom. there's a huge effort to stop African Americans being integrated. A huge reason as to why, and eventually, once Reconstruction failed, the North stopped trying. They pulled. There was an economic crisis, and I think the North cared less about North.
Were they punished at all by the government, financially or economically?
I
Sanctions,
can't
maybe.
say much about the Klan. I know the Klan was effectively destroyed in the 1870s under General Grant's presidency. It came back in the 1920s, but it was the Klan didn't really need to. It was kind of destroyed, but the paramilitary groups died once Reconstruction was officially over. Because once Reconstruction was over, and the North was more focused about their bank accounts than they were about the South anymore. Um, that's when the South was given full force to handle integration the way they wanted it to handle it, and the North was officially out of their business. And well, the South didn't want to handle integration, and that's when they enabled these segregation laws and these Jim Crow laws across the country. And that's when they would pass all of those tests, literacy tests, to make sure that black people couldn't vote,
Yes.
that were rigged against them, and they did everything in their power to ostracize African Americans from social and political life. So that they,
Instead of taking the anti-slavery candidate directly off the ballot.
yes, that was a way. We think about segregation. Why did, because again, segregation wasn't the initial. It didn't like slavery didn't end and segregation didn't begin the next day. It was a gradual process, and segregation was founded upon as a backup. If they couldn't, it was a way to keep control over African Americans without owning them outright. There is a lot of concern by the elite and the former plantation class, the rich people in the South, that if poor white Southerners who couldn't own slaves, if they decided to work together with poor black people, they could overthrow the elite, and that they could be a real thorn in their side. This was a concern going back into the slavery days, and if they were able to keep black people away from white life, they wouldn't ever get to know them. They wouldn't ever get to mingle with them. They wouldn't get to organize with them and work together and learn to love each other. This is a quote from Tom Watson, who was a populist leader in 1892. He gave this speech in Georgia. This is part of his speech. He said, "You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism which enslaves you both." And that was given to a crowd of both white and black people in Georgia in 1892. So even back then, those who wanted to see it could see through the farce they were being sold, that segregation and racial white supremacy was really just a way to consolidate. I mean, it was a cultural thing, but in practicality, it was a way to consolidate wealth and power into the elite former plantation classes, and to keep the whites on their side and not ever thinking twice about going after them instead.
What I find especially interesting is that post Civil War, we've had presidents from both sides take office.
Yeah.
Many veterans from the war, both from the Confederacy and the Union, which it's interesting how it didn't have too much of an impact on how things were run, that there was no resurgence or second Civil War. Was there anything to prevent that?
Well, the North, again, after Reconstruction, tensions were really high, or during Reconstruction, tensions were really high. But it's important to know the North wasn't invaded, besides Gettysburg. It was never invaded. The war was never at their homes. So the South always was way more angry than the North was. Again, whiny babies is the way I like to look at it, which may be harsh and unprofessional, but I think it gets the point across. The North changed their tune after Reconstruction. They stopped caring that much. The war was over. They had won. They went back home, and it sucked. Excuse me, but it was over. And so the South, this is where we're getting into lost causism. If the North didn't care that much, and again, the North, yes, they ended slavery, but they're by no means a racial paradise. The North had immense racism problems of its own. So, if anything, the North was ready to reconcile with their white people in the South, and they were to keep up aggravating them and risking another civil war. And so eventually they chose to reconcile with the South at the expense of African Americans and racial equality across the country.
Which makes sense. It follows a
Yeah.
previous political pattern.
Yeah. And that's why Lost Cause became so embedded in the American cultural system and in American culture.
Define lost cause for me.
Yes, the lost cause is the idea that slavery was not the initial cause of secession, and that the South was the victim of Northern tyranny. That's where the idea of the War of Northern Aggression comes from. They would always refer to it as the war between the states instead of the Civil War. It started because mostly it was a slow process. By the 1880s, 1890s, it had been firmly planted. The Daughters of the Confederacy was one of the big founding institutions that pushed this form of education of the Civil War, because this was about 10, 20 years afterwards. They realized their dads were getting old, and they wanted to make sure that they wanted to control the memory of how their father's fight would be remembered as. So they came up with this idea that it wasn't actually about slavery. It was just about tyranny and states' rights. And that's, even to this day, states' rights is a big mantra for a lot of people
Yes.
in politics. It doesn't really
Most
come
of
for
this
that.
is,
But
I would say it is resolved, but I've been, in recent years, we've seen a lot of this coming
But even today,
undone.
we have arguments over these statues, over Confederate soldiers, over people flying the Confederate flag, over high schools and forts named after Confederate generals. All of that was done. Most of those statues were put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy, not during the war. They are pieces of history, but they were put up specifically as propaganda pieces by the Daughters of the Confederacy and other similar groups. And these high schools were named by these groups as a way to control and idolize the Confederate soldier and the memory of them as something noble. And again, Fort Sumter, Confederates fired the first shot. They started secession. They seceded over slavery. They said it themselves in the Cornerstone speech. And now they're changing their tune to make sure that they can control the narrative over what happened. And as another way to control how, and to make sure they can control segregation. Because if the North was ready to reconcile with them and admit that it was over states' rights or just not really care anymore, they put up these Confederate idols, and that keeps white people in the South idolizing the Confederacy and the ways of the Old South, and that keeps them still angry at African Americans and wanting to keep that old hierarchy of Africans at the bottom and white people at the top. And they would idolize the antebellum South in books and movies, with The Birth of a Nation and
Which you
Gone
have
with the
covered
Wind.
extensively.
I have watched those movies. They are horrible. In fact, The Birth of a Nation was so popular. That's a film that it portrayed, again, the war as a war of aggression, of tyranny, and it said that the Ku Klux Klan was a heroic organization that was meant to, basically, in the film's own words, put African Americans back in their place. And through, the film openly shows them terrorizing and using violent force against African Americans, and it idealizes it. It says this is the way the world has to be. It even uses religious imagery to make this fight of the Southerner against the North and against their African neighbors as a holy one. And it was so popular in the 1910s that, again, the Klan died in the 70s. The Klan came back in the 1920s and 1910s because of that
Wow.
movie, and it is still going to this day because of that movie. The Klan was completely dead from the 1870s to the 1910s, and it came back because of Birth of a Nation.
And as film, not particularly film students, but we have studied film, taken film classes before, we see a lot of discussion of this film because of its, not just its historical significance, but because of its significance in the development of modern day films, which I find absolutely bewildering how much of an influence this one film has had, not just on filmmaking, but on the course of politics, on the course of history.
It's a double-edged sword because it is a highly potent propaganda piece, but it also, unfortunately, pioneers a lot about how we make movies. And so it became very important technically for people to keep showing that movie. And then when you keep showing that movie to teach people, maybe you're just trying to show it to teach them shot composition or whatever, or technical aspects, you're still spreading that propaganda piece, and it became ingrained in film teaching, and still even is today, to this day.
Many cases, this is a piece of history that has not been finished. It
No.
is still being written.
And then to this day, I want to, even going beyond Birth of a Nation here, to this day we feel the impacts of the lost cause in modern political debates. People still to this day insist, even though the general consensus from historians is that it was over slavery, we still hear arguments that it wasn't, or that it wasn't over race at all. I mean, back then when the lost cause started, they would say it's over race, just not over slavery. But now the lost cause has changed tune again after the civil rights movement, because during the civil rights movement, the Civil War was used as imagery to justify not giving equal rights to everybody. In fact, many of the states in the 1950s and 60s, during the peak of the civil rights movement, they changed their flags to include the Confederate banner somewhere in their state logos. Many of those kept the Confederate flags in their logo up until the 2000s. I don't think Alabama changed theirs until like 2001, 2004. I'd have to double check. But the point is that this propaganda of the lost cause and the memory of the Civil War was so potent, and it was always been used as a way to keep African Americans in a place of subordinance. The lost cause was a tool to uphold segregation and a racial hierarchy with whites at the top, Africans at the bottom, and even today, even in movies that like aren't that bad, movies like Gettysburg or Good, Bad, and the Ugly, these are films that are all about the Civil War, and they hardly ever mention slavery. They still posit the Civil War as a war between states, and they're fighting over different reasons, and slavery is more of a backdrop and not the cause of the war. And again, it's like this collective amnesia, and it's because Reconstruction failed and because the South was given the ability and the power to control the memory of the Civil War and essentially lie about it so that they could keep and uphold a system of white supremacy. And I'm done. That's how I'm going to wrap up there.
Well, let's lead into our next segment, which will start in the year 1960, leading up to the civil rights movement. How do we get from there, from the 1920s? What major historical changes within the next 3 minutes or so? Summarize
how we got
30 years or so. We have,
obviously,
for sure, World War II is a very big player in this.
The dark days were after Reconstruction up until the early 1900s. Lots of laws were passed enforcing basically the idea of separate but equal.
Yes.
Was the Supreme Court's ruling that if they were separate, then it's fine if they're not fully integrated.
Segregation lasted for a long time.
Yes.
In those decades in between.
So obviously, African Americans they never accepted this fully. There was always resistance. There was always movements. I know in the early 1900s and late 1800s, a lot of the idea was sort of to prove themselves, to educate themselves, and to work themselves into positions of higher power, to essentially prove and disprove the stereotypes put against them, and to show that we are human beings as equal as you and we deserve equal rights. So a lot of the emphasis was on education and proving themselves. Towards the mid 20th century, I mean, the system was so rigged against them, they couldn't vote. It made it incredibly hard to get into systems of power. The tune changed in the actual heart of the civil rights movement, which was the late 40s into the early 60s. A lot of the younger generations at that time weren't as content just going to school and getting educated. They wanted equality, and they wanted it now. And so they devised ways and methods to force America to finally address the race issue and to no longer beat around the bush. They weren't going to wait any longer. And I think that gets us to where you want to be. That's the best of my memory of the situation.
That's a good summary for less than 3 minutes.
Yeah.
It's hard to it's daunting. And to be fair, some locations were different than others in the speed at which things were reintegrated. I mean, the South obviously had a huge problem. We're going to talk a tiny bit about the Greensboro sit-ins, which kind of sparked a
changing moment.
semi-national protest of lunch counters and the segregation that they enforced. But that will be coming up here on History Repeating. Welcome back. You're listening to History Repeating on Hillsborough College's Hawk Radio, live from Ybor City.
It's true.
And unfortunately, because of our late start, we haven't had more shows to talk about Black History Month. So we are dedicating this episode to talking about Black history. And the Civil War, I think, is definitely a very important in Black history, but it's also good to talk about the wins in Black history and some black joy as well. And this one is definitely a struggle, but we're trying to keep it a little local here, and it does have a happy ending, and we'll also be talking about some prominent figures in this movement. So today I am talking about Tampa's Woolworth sit-ins, which is something that I personally didn't know about until maybe about a month ago. Most people that I talk to have never heard of this, and I had never heard of Woolworth beforehand.
I had.
Um,
I don't think they exist anymore, but I've heard of them before.
I looked into it. Apparently, there's a couple locations in Germany, and I believe Austria. Don't
Okay.
quote me on that, but there are like very, very, very few left in Europe of all places.
I wonder what caused them to go out. Probably Walmart. I'll have to guess.
Yeah,
I
mean
it's
that
gonna be
was
Walmart.
their. If you haven't heard of Woolworth, it's FTW. Sorry, not FTW. FW Woolworth. It was a 5 and dime store, or essentially the early version of a general large retailer store. Think Macy's, think Walmart, think
Target.
I guess Target kind of is the modern.
Yeah, because they have food in there sometimes
Yeah.
too. Because Woolworth would have.
Woolworth
lunch
had
counter.
these long lunch counters that would stretch down the entire store, which I think is kind of interesting. You don't really see anything like that nowadays. Kind of with the trend of pharmacies. You used to be able to buy ice cream and desserts at pharmacies.
We should bring that back.
We should bring that back. That's probably what's killing Walgreens is they don't have
No more
a
ice
Sunday
cream.
counter. But yeah, in the era, this was a very popular thing to have lunch counters. And of course, it was the 1960s where this story takes place. So these lunch counters were segregated, which meant, unfortunately, you couldn't sit at the counter and eat. In many cases, if you were black, you were allowed to place an order, but you could not stay and eat it. So we're going to be talking about what some really great heroes who are Tampa natives did to protest that. I wanted to mention that this episode is attributed to a new documentary that recently screened here at Hillsborough College titled Triumph, Tampa's Untold Chapter in the Civil Rights Movement, directed by local documentarian and one of our colleagues, Danny Bruno. It details the history of Tampa's Woolworth sit-ins, which were sparked by the famous Greensboro sit-ins, which took place in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the documentary itself was inspired by a recent play produced by Stageworks here in Tampa titled When the Righteous Triumph. So there's a lot of inspiration, a lot of pitching off each other, but I think it is really good that we're highlighting this piece of history, especially because I had no idea, and neither did.
No, I didn't know.
And I'm proud to say that a lot of the students who participated in the sit-in came from Howard W. Blake High School, which was the high school that I attended. I did not graduate from there, but I did attend. And I did know briefly a short history of Blake High School, but I did not know that there were so many civil rights activists later than senators, attorneys that were brought up from there. So I think that's really interesting. This had been a long-standing issue at the time. In many cases, if you were black and sat at the counter, they would either close the counter or they would tell you to leave and refuse service to you. So
they could call the cops on you too.
Yes, which was very common.
What would happen.
This movement was led by Clarence Fort, who was the then president of Tampa's NAACP Youth Council. He organized the protests with around 40 students from both Middleton High School and Howard W. Blake High School. I'm aware that Howard W. Blake High School was a predominantly black high school in a predominantly black neighborhood, so there was a lot of support for these movements. It was also backed by Reverend A. Leon Lowry, who was a former a former teacher of Martin Luther King Jr. at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, which I thought was incredible. Yeah. The idea was to sit in at the lunch counters peacefully, not to order anything, but just to sit among their fellow civilians. It was essentially that. It was a peaceful protest and an act of defiance against an unjust law. And what was really amazing about these protests is that the then mayor, Julian B. Lane, who was a veteran, and you might recognize his name because we have Julian B. Lane Park here in Tampa now honoring him. He was a former veteran who served among many black soldiers, and he started a biracial committee here in Tampa and was very serious about civil rights and the progression.
That's something I like to talk about too. Is that oddly enough, because war is never that good, but oddly enough, in American history, it is always a point of change for the civil rights movement.
Yes.
This obviously the Civil War is a big one, but World War One was soldiers they go off to Europe and they come back and they're like, wait, people in France, they kind of treat me like I'm almost a person. And then they don't want to come back after that. And so when they do come back, they come back angry and they organize and they protest. World War II, because America's involvement in World War I was a little more limited, but World War II was a big one, especially fighting against fascism and Hitler and racism in Europe. They came back and they were like, why can't we do the same thing here? So, and a lot of American
Europe was
soldiers,
a lot farther ahead with these sort of ideas. And Tampa is no stranger to, especially during Cuba's fight for independence. Tampa was a main hub for soldiers leaving America to Cuba, and that caused a lot of scuffle because white soldiers who were put in Tampa or were stationed in Tampa weren't used to seeing as much integration that we had here, which caused. And this is pre 1900, so this is going a little bit back, but.
Wasn't that the Spanish-American War?
Spanish-American War, yeah.
That's very old.
Yeah, I was gonna say this is much farther before, but just to show that Tampa does have a little bit of history there. With
Mexican-American War, not Spanish. Sorry. We know it was Spanish.
Yeah, it was Spanish.
I
Yeah,
got it right. Well,
yeah.
I won't even think.
Don't doubt yourself.
Everyone forgets that war even happened.
No, yeah. I mean, I didn't. I only started studying it a few months ago, but it is incredibly interesting, and Tampa does play a powerful role in that war, as well as not just in the war, but also in the development of Tampa. A lot of that war shaped how Tampa is today, especially with the amount of Cuban immigrants that we have. They built this city. Yes, the protest was peaceful completely. Demonstrators sat at lunch counters among white customers and simply stayed peaceful. They barely talked. They just put their presence there and made their presence known. And the then mayor, Julian B. Lane, was very supportive of the protesters. He ordered the police force to essentially escort the protesters and, I shouldn't say, demonstrators, to escort the demonstrators and protect them from any throwing of objects or any acts of, or incite, what's the word?
Insurrection.
Any sort of violence incited by
harassment
from the opposing side,
or
which
worse.
was which was very noble. And
if you've seen footage from any other city,
many other cities. I know Sarasota was
opposite.
Another city that these sit-ins took place. I believe Fort Lauderdale as well. So Florida was also leading in this trend along with North Carolina. But there were many lunch counter sit-in protests occurring over the nation, and I have to say, Tampa was one of the most peaceful
and one of the earliest
and one of the earliest that occurred. So I think it is very noble. We're going to highlight some of the protesters. One who was there and one I was very, very, very fortunate to meet was Arthenia Joyner. We met her at the screening here at HCC.
And I met her at WEDU PBS.
A little bit earlier than I did, yeah. She's incredibly nice, and it is kind of groundbreaking to see these people, these civil rights activists who you hear their name in a book or you see their name online and you think that they are a part of history, that they are now long gone, but truthfully, this only took place a little over 60 years ago.
Not that long ago. I mean, we're still. Whenever you meet someone that old, it always puts things in.
Not that she's old. She's very.
No, but I mean, like someone that part of something that important.
Yeah.
It puts it all into perspective, and you remember that this was someone's life. This wasn't.
Yeah.
it's not just words in a book anymore. It's like this is a lived
It's yeah,
experience.
it's a continuing story. I should mention that these protests took place in February of 1960 and occurred throughout the year. At the time, Joyner was 17 years old. She was a junior attending Middleton High School. It was one of the motivators in inspiring her to become a attorney and to fight for civil rights for her fellow African Americans to have a place here in American society. And I think what she did was really just honorable, and she deserves every bit of
Oh yeah,
praise that she's had for it since.
it's especially just me sitting right now thinking about it. You like again, we talked about how it's surreal to meet people like this, and then to know that it's real. It's not just words on the paper. I think getting that emotion across and hearing their voices, like in those films, is incredibly important because I think when people collectively forget, I mean, like you don't forget it. Everyone knows segregation happened. Everyone knows slavery
Yeah.
happened. But when you don't have that connection any longer, that personal connection, you forget the emotion. It's just words on a paper. You know it happened, but you don't feel it happened. And because you don't feel it happened, to your mind, it basically didn't happen. And then it's easy to ignore. And now today, a lot of people like that's what they want to do. They want less Black history taught, less Black history mentioned. A lot of just uttering Black history around many people today can just annoy someone. And then when you go and meet someone who was there and talk to people who grew up at this time like we did, and you hear just like what it was like growing up in
It's life
segregation.
changing, and for some people, history is it's more or less like you it doesn't it's considered a boring topic, but to see it actually in front of you, to meet these people and to hear their words, knowing that they were there at such a pivotal time in American history is just an amazing feeling. And
But it's also frustrating to me because when I hear that like they're like I grew up they're telling us like I grew up I couldn't go to a water fountain, I couldn't go to the same bathroom, I had to like do certain things before I left the house. I had to watch where I was going, and you hear all this stuff and how they grew up, and it's like you get frustrated hearing. It's like, yeah, if I lived through that, I'd want everyone to know. I'd want to tell people about it. I'd want to make a
yeah,
month to remember it. I'd want to make people sure people would understand and feel that same frustration I felt or that they felt. So then it gets frustrating that so many people don't want to hear it and that they would just like to forget it. And of course, there are ulterior motives to letting people forget these these points in history.
yeah, but it did have a happy ending. It took a while, but by September of 1960, a total of 18 department stores in Tampa had desegregated lunch counters, which I think was a record time, as well as a record number of stores. And I didn't realize Tampa had that many stores. The Woolworth sit ins occurred on Central Avenue, which is now long gone. Well, it's not Central Avenue anymore, but there is a plaque commemorating the Woolworth sit-ins, and
Rather recently
yeah,
put up,
it was
wasn't
it
it?
was I believe
Within the past couple of
of
years.
this year. Yeah, there is a plaque commemorating it in downtown Tampa. The store itself closed during the 1990s. I'm assuming for
That's later than I thought.
yeah, I'm assuming either for scrutiny regarding this or for
I think probably
or
went out of
department
business. I
store.
think they just
Yeah,
went out of business.
department stores have their runs.
On
But
the way of
it is
Sears.
currently vacant, and there is a plaque outside. They had a commencement, or not a commencement, but a honoring ceremony
Ribbon
for
cutting.
yeah, something like
Like I'll
that.
like
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
literally, but like that.
But yeah, there is a historical marker outside now, and you can visit the location, which is incredibly interesting. So if you're in Tampa and you're interested, go check it out. And if you're interested in watching the documentary where I sourced my facts from, it is available to stream for free on the PBS app or on wedu.org. I would also like to thank Hillsborough County's website and Jonathan Abrams with the New York Times for providing the information that I used in this show.
For me, I had like a few word on sources I forgot to mention. Most of my stuff came about the Civil War itself came from Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. A lot of my stuff on on Reconstruction and its effects was from teachingamericanhistory.org, and a lot of other stuff about segregation, the lost cause, and a lot of the social effects of poor white Southerners versus rich white Southerners comes from Carrie Lee Merritt and Jeffrey Glossner, who is from University of Mississippi, and Carrie Merritt is a historian.
I also, unfortunately, don't have any information on Stageworks' production of When the Righteous Triumph. But if it does return, I know they did it at Stageworks near downtown Tampa as well as the Straz Center. If it does return, I would seriously recommend checking it out. I've seen footage of it. I've not seen the actual show, but it looks pretty incredible.
It looks good.
The actors look like they did a great job. We'd like to thank you for tuning in to History Repeating.